Okay. So this is, can
Hi,
you
Dr.
see us?
Hi,
No.
Dr. Maté.
Huh?
Yeah, I can see you. Yeah.
Okay. So this is Dr. Claire O'Connor, who is got her PhD here and is co-directing this class. And Max Jones, I think you know, who graduated summa cum laude in the spring. And I've asked him to introduce you because I know you obviously by reputation and your work, but you've actually changed his life.
Hmm.
Uh, well, he says that and gives you a lot of credit, and he's a great success story. And so I would like to have him, and we're here to talk about your book. We're at the tail end of a Contours of Change course. We're trying to figure out where the world is headed, and we end up with Orwell and Huxley, two dystopian views, and Chomsky and so forth. But this is really basically the last class, and we wanted to end with well. Let me just give the title: "The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture." And that I can't think of any better way to kind of summarize the issues we face. Max, why don't you provide a proper introduction?
Yeah, so Dr. Gabor Maté is an MD and a New York Times bestselling author. He's known for books like Scattered Minds, The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder, In the Realm of Hungry Ghost, Close Encounters with Addiction, and most recently, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. He's an expert in childhood development, addiction, and trauma, and investigates these issues through the lens of compassionate inquiry, a psychotherapeutic method developed by him that reveals what lies beneath the appearance we present to the world. And as you'll see today, Maté applies compassionate inquiry not only to individuals, but entire societies as well. So without further ado, here's Dr. Gabor
No, a
Maté.
little further ado.
Yeah.
Explain why his work has been so significant to you.
Yeah. So I think that the reason that Dr. Mate's work is so important to me is because I've gone through, life-changing events. Like my father passed away in 2019, and it brought me to low points in my life. And before I found the work of Dr. Maté, I actually I think healed a lot from those things, but eventually those wounds, I guess, started to bother me again and affect me very heavily. And it wasn't until I found Dr. Gabor Maté that I was able to kind of contextualize these things and realize why I felt the way I feel. And, I think that he talks a lot about how when we experience traumatic situations that even when we heal, we develop scars, and under those scars, they're more tender than the skin around it. And I realized that a lot of the problems I was facing came from not realizing and not recognizing those scars. And also, I think he has this part of the book called afflictions as adaptations or something like that. Is that right, Doctor?
Yeah.
And I think what that allowed me to see was that a lot of the things that I hated about myself, um, you know, uh, just a lot of the behaviors that I wish I could change about myself did not begin. I didn't develop these things just for no reason or because I'm a bad person, but that they are actually there to help me at one point. And just because I couldn't get rid of them in the present, and sometimes they caused uh, negativity in my life in the present, that they were there to help me at one point. And seeing them through that lens made me actually appreciate them. And I couldn't have, gotten to that perspective without reading the work and listening to the lectures of Dr. Gabor Maté.
Good. So let's begin. And do you want to add anything, Claire? No. Let's begin. And I think we also have another speaker in the second half that Claire will introduce, dealing again with the Palestinian situation, but from a medical perspective. And what I want to ask you, this is a contours of change class, and basically the reason I wanted to have you here is to put our current situation in that context. What are the historical trends? Where does our system of governance and economy fit in? And, basically the myth of normal. And what is this toxic culture that you're referring to?
So it's a very simple, by the way, for everybody, I prefer to be referred to and called by my first name, Gabor, rather than the formal doctor designation. It makes me feel very old. So, but in terms of the toxic culture, if you take a simple medical analogy, or I should say a laboratory analogy, if you're growing organisms, microorganisms in a petri dish, you have to, we call that culturing, a culture medium. And if the organisms in that container were thriving, proliferating, growing well, you'd say that's a healthy culture. But if many of them are showing signs of pathology, dysfunction, or dying, you say that's a toxic culture. And as the American broadcaster and thinker Thomas Hartman said, a culture can be either toxic or nurturing. Now, if you look at our culture as that petri dish, what results are we seeing? We're seeing increasing number of people dying of overdoses. In the United States, last year, more than twice as many Americans died of overdoses as died in all the years of Vietnam, Iraq, and the Afghan wars put together. That's in 1 year. The rate of childhood suicide is going up. The rate of autoimmune illnesses is going up. Depression, anxiety are growing diagnoses. The number of children being diagnosed with ADHD or oppositionality or anxiety, these numbers are all going up. 70% of adult Americans are at least on one medication. 40% are on two medications. The life expectancy of non-college educated Americans is going down. Internationally, these trends are showing up under the impact of globalization. So we're going to call that, you have to call it a toxic culture. And that's what I mean. So that if you look at the culture in terms of the impact of the culture on its denizens or citizens, that's what we're seeing. And I could talk about what makes this culture toxic, but I'm saying that it is. So this is in the face of all the medical advances, the miracles of modern science, the wealth that we have, the information that we have. In the face of all this, these are the patterns. So we can make an assumption that there's some kind of a unexplainable something going on, unexplainable, or we can say these are all genetic diseases, which they are not. Scientifically, that's utter nonsense. Or we have to ask, are there some identifiable factors in this culture that lead people to despair and to illness? And my conclusion that those factors are identifiable, easily recognizable, and rooted in the nature of the culture.
And feel like, can you make those links? Because that's what we're here to discuss, the contours of change. How did we get to this place? Why has this modern technology, development, wealth basically failed us in this sort of way? And what can you do about it?
Well, when you say failed us, there's a kind of an assumption, which is that modern science and technology and the whole social structure is designed to help us. That's the assumption. If that's the assumption, then it's failed. But what if that's not the assumption? What if the assumption is that it's actually working for somebody? So let me give you an example. You can say that the Iraq war was a failure if the assumption is that the Iraq war was designed to liberate Iraq or to spread democracy. Then it was a failure. But what if that wasn't the intention? What if the intention was to enhance the power of the military-industrial complex, to enrich the arms manufacturers, to convey the message to anybody in the American empire that if you dare to resist us, you'll be pulverized, then it was a complete success. So if you make the assumption about our culture and the science and the technology that this culture is so adept at generating, that is designed to help us be happier, more self-fulfilled, more realized human beings, then it's a failure. But if the assumption is that it's designed to maintain power and profit in the hands of the few, then it's an utter success. So what is a success and what is a failure depends very much on what our assumptions are.
Thank you. No, that's very clear and powerful. One of the things that we've been discovering over the last semester with this very bright group of students we're working with is that people are quite conscious of the discrepancy you're describing. That we all have, and this is a phrase first uttered in this class by a student, a kind of cognitive dissonance we're struggling with, where we're conscious of the discrepancy you just described, who benefits, who doesn't, and struggling basically at a daily level to either reconcile that dissonance or push the respective parts further apart for greater clarity in our own thinking and interactions. What do you think about that psychological experience? What do you say to young people who are struggling with that in their bodies and minds?
Well, the dissonance, if I can, as I understand it, is between what people are actually experiencing in their hearts and their bodies and what they're being told, the narrative that they grow up inside in. So that it's difficult to align our minds with our actual lived experience. In other words, it's difficult to align the contents of our minds, which are very much conditioned by what we've been told. Let me read you something. I'm sure that the name Robert Sapolsky is very familiar to you. And he's a neurobiologist at Stanford. And he's written a book recently called Determined. And by determined, he really means predetermined. And he basically says that there's very little free will in the world because we're largely so, conditioned by our environment. Now, in Huxley's Brave New World, which I think Bob mentioned in the beginning, people are actually incubated in the test tube to fulfill certain social roles. And so in that world, the whole ethic is that people should want to do what they have to do for society. Well, we're not quite living in that test tube world, but we're very much living in a world that conditions us from even before birth. And so Sapolsky says that we're nothing more or less than the sum of what we could not control: our biology, our environments, their interactions. And that means that we grew up in a certain matrix. And that matrix has us believe in a certain view of the world and of ourselves in the world. So there's that. Then there's our actual lived experience. And so much of what we're told and the way we're conditioned cannot make sense of our lived experience because it's designed to deny our lived experience. We're actually designed to disconnect ourselves from our lived experience and believe in an ideology that would deny our lived experience. Well, that creates a tremendous tension on people. And not only that, everybody here wants a career. You're all studying, whether you're going to be psychologists or historians or sociologists or philosophers or whoever you're going to be. You are pursuing your studies probably for two valid reasons. One of them is you just want to know the truth. You want to understand the world. You have this yearning for knowledge. But the other is you want to live a life, you want to make a career. But what happens if what you find out about the truth, if you speak it, you don't have a career? Well, now you're in a tremendously divided position. Talk about dichotomy. And everybody who's seeking the truth in a society faces that dilemma of, number one, of having to go against just the sheer emotional challenge of going against your elders and what you've been told and the values and inculcated views of your culture. That's hard enough. But on top of that, if you do so, if you do stand up with your own truth, your lived experience against what you've been told, you don't have a career. Or at least your capacity to have one is gravely threatened. And if you want to know the truth of what I'm talking about, just look at what happens to anybody who speaks on behalf of Palestinians these days. I'm not talking about, I haven't talked about that issue or the truth of it, but I'm telling you, people are losing their jobs, their careers are being threatened. And this is not the first time in American history that speaking one's own truth, right or wrong, threatens your livelihood. So going back to your question, this discrepancy, there's a powerful reason it should be so disconcerting for people.
Just a quick follow-up. Thank you so much. I think there's this secondary consideration then, and the tremendous value of contributions like people like you, to recognizing the social explanations. I think you were pointing to this too, Max. The social explanations for what we're conditioned to feel our individual experiences. And I think right now, and I'm experiencing this myself and have been because of the repetition you're describing. This is not a new moment of suppression and censorship. I've seen it before. When you refer to the Iraq War, that was probably the first moment for me in my life, my adulthood, when that was really prominent. But turning out, being able to find the language to talk about mental health, to talk about personal experience in social terms is almost the precondition for building new collective experience that can help us actually survive. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about, or, advice, but also observations you've made about how that kind of shift can be so helpful. I think this would be a great moment to do that.
Well, I think the word collective is really essential here because human beings are basically social creatures. This is another one of the toxicities of the culture is that we're given a certain view of human nature, that we're individualistic, aggressive, selfish, greedy beings. That ain't necessarily so, to quote Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. Actually, we're social creatures. Our brains are conditioned, are wired together. The Los Angeles-based, UCLA-based psychiatrist Dan Siegel talks about our interpersonal neurobiology, that our nervous systems are actually wired together, which they are. And we're basically social creatures needing companionship, needing connection, which means that the antidote to the individualizing, dehistoricizing ethic of this culture is actually collective connection with other people. It's very difficult. It's a very rare person who can maintain their own sense of values, their own connection to their truth as best they understand it, just on their own. So that, especially in times of crisis, such as it's almost like in an ongoing crisis right now, the collective is very important, so that to seek people who can support you, who can understand you, who can validate you, who can call you out when you're off base, in other words, who don't uncritically support you. I mean, there's a lot of collectives these days where people just live in a bubble and they uncritically support each other's insanity. So when I talk about collective, I'm not talking about that unconditionally conditioned acceptance of nonsense. I'm talking about a collective that's committed to truth, which means that we call each other out. But at the same time, we're not alone. So I think that the only response to what's going on right now, and I don't just mean that particular war at the moment, I'm talking about the whole crisis of the culture, is a collective response.
So let me
sorry. For example, such as this conversation, Okay, please go ahead.
So let me talk about this conversation, because the conceit is that we are at the forefront of questioning and thinking about where do we get the narrative, where does the culture come from, and so forth, and how do we examine it. I heard Werner Herzog, a very great filmmaker, speak here on the weekend in LA, and he talked about control of the narrative is the key to freedom, understanding freedom. So what is the narrative? On the way here today, I have one of our star students graduated here, Max Jones, in the car. And he's taken a few classes with me, summa cum laude graduate here. And we were just talking about war in Israel, Gaza. But I mentioned something about Vietnam, and he said, but that was a civil war. And the idea that Vietnam was a civil war rather than on the part of the French to restore their colonial empire, and then by the United States to create a neo-colonial empire. Here is a star student, and I'm not faulting him, but this narrative that somehow it was a civil war between a free South Vietnam and a communist-controlled North Vietnam and so forth, an absolute denial of a history, and that denial is now so well documented. Yet you can go through a first-rate American education, and we think we are one of the top communication schools in the world, maybe the top, and yet be left with this idea that this major event in American and world history, and I feel some personal connection since I went to Vietnam to write about it. I wrote about it, and here I am in a car with a prize, wonderful student who hasn't gotten any of the counter view in his education. Another footnote here that maybe Claire can talk about, we are part of this communications profession, and they were just having their convention. And the head of the group, now let Claire, why don't you describe what happened? Because it's
Yeah, I mean, most of you are communications majors. At the undergraduate level, you often don't get involved with the major associations, but the two ones that are quite significant are the National Communication Association and the International Communication Association. And NCA, the National Association, just had its big annual conference this past weekend. The president of NCA is a Palestinian scholar, and as his, presidential address at the conference, which is a standard thing, had invited 6 other scholars, including another Palestinian scholar, to speak about the state of the profession, or the field. And they submitted their talks in advance, and I wasn't there, but my understanding is that the entire presentation was canceled because of the use of the language of genocide and decolonization, in reference to what is happening in the Middle East right now. So that theme of censorship is very active, and I think what you're highlighting is important.
Right, and I want to extend that to get back to your book, because what is normalcy? And the whole point of Huxley and Orwell was to say you can make the totalitarian normal, either with the fist and scare people and control everything, or you can do it by seduction and manipulation and drugs and so forth. And what you see on the campuses now, my reading of it, is in the name of normalcy, we're told not to debate fundamentals because you're creating a hostile environment. You're making people insecure. You're getting them upset. So it's actually quite perverse. If we try to explain what is going on, which you would think is the function of education, we're failing the therapy that students require to be normal. And so I would like to get your reaction to that.
Well, so first of all, going back to this question of we're failing, well, that's making an assumption, going back to what I said in the beginning.
It got you again.
Well, what if the function of education is to inculcate people in a certain point of view? Look, as far as cancellations, I had a major speech. I was invited to give at a Canadian university last week, not on the subject of Israel-Palestine, nothing to do with politics, just on my view of health and stress and addictions. And it was canceled because I'd spoken out as a Jew, critical of Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. It was sold out. The invitation was given a year ago. It was all arranged. The tickets were bought. My plane tickets were booked. They canceled me. That's how much free speech there is in this society. No, that's the first point. The second point is in terms of normalcy. If anybody stands up and justifies the killing of thousands of Palestinian children by means of bombs supplied or funded by the United States, nobody would censor them. That's perfectly okay. That's perfectly normal to stand up and justify the mass killing of children. Should you stand up and criticize that? For example, this word genocide. You know who used it? Two Israeli scholars of the Holocaust have said that what's happening right now is either a textbook case of genocide. I'm quoting one Israeli Jewish Holocaust scholar, or another one who said that it's veering close to genocide. These are Jews. These are Israelis who said that. They are never quoted in the mainstream media. And if a Palestinian says it, they're canceled. That's normal in this culture. And as far as the narrative is concerned, the narrative is always controlled by those in power. So if your student Max does not know that Vietnam was a French colony oppressed and exploited by the French, against whom then they fought a brilliant, heroic guerrilla war, which result the Americans did not want to accept because they could not accept an independent Asian country, free of their empire. So then they came in with murderous, genocidal force, killed 3 million Vietnamese. 3 million. And Bob, I remember your work in the 60s. That's where I first learned your name, when I was a student myself. And I remember your reporting and your commentary. And they seeded the country with toxic chemicals. Children are still being born with cancer, which the Americans refuse to clean up and take responsibility for. If your star student Max doesn't know that, that speaks to the success of the system, not to its failure.
Gabor, I was wondering if you could, because we're talking a lot about free speech and what happens as a consequence of people that speak truth to power, like, for example, those that stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. If you could talk about authenticity versus attachment, which is something that you talk about very often, and connect it to how in childhood we deal with the authenticity versus attachment when, like, I think that you say it's a lot less painful for a child to believe that there's something wrong with them than there's something wrong with the world that's supposed to take care of them. And you know, therefore they sacrifice their authenticity for attachment to their parents or their caretakers or something like that. and how it kind of connects into the it connects to our world when we become adults as well, because I think, like a theme that I recognize when people don't want to, for example, stand in solidarity with Palestine because they're afraid that they might lose their job or they might be censored or something or another, is because there's essentially sacrificing their authenticity for some kind of attachment, right? And you could just speak to that and how you see it play into both childhood and adulthood.
Well, I'm very glad to be able to speak about my book. We've been talking about everything except my book. At least we're talking around the themes of my book, so I'm glad to delve into it. Just a quick comment about speaking truth to power. I don't do that. I don't speak to power. Power is not interested in what I have to say. The power is not, I mean, you know what? I hate to tell you this, but Joe Biden never phones me for advice. Justin Trudeau never calls me. Benjamin Netanyahu never calls me. They don't call me. I don't know why, but they don't. So I don't speak truth to power. I just speak truth to whoever will listen. And I suggest you reframe that for yourselves. You're not speaking truth to power. Powers, their ears are closed. They have an agenda. They don't want to know what you think. Now, authenticity versus attachment. So attachment is the most powerful dynamic in human life. It's a gravitational force pulling two bodies together like this. Like the Earth gravitates, the gravitational field of the sun keeps the planets revolving and circulating around the sun. It's a force of gravity pulling two bodies together. Now, in the emotional sense, it's the same thing. It pulls two bodies together for the purpose of being taken care of or taking care of the other. So mammalian life, never mind human life, mammalian life could not subsist without that attachment drive. So it's built into the mammalian brain. Whether you're a horse or a whale or an elephant or a human being, you have attachment circuitry in your brain to pull you closer to the infant, so you'll take care of the infant, and pulls the infant close to you so that they can be taken care of. And that attachment drive of being close to others is with us all our lives. It's necessary for procreation, community building, friendship, relationship, but it's never more essential, more crucial, and indispensable than in infancy and early childhood, because literally the young human would not survive without it. So it's a powerful drive to attach and to connect. But we have another need as well, which is what I call authenticity, auto, the Greek for self, being ourselves. And that's very important as well. And it literally means being in touch with our feelings, our bodies, and knowing how to act based on that connection. Now, there's a question that I ask to audiences wherever I speak, a very simple question. I can ask it of your audience now, and I'm going to ask it, although I can't see the audience. But let me ask the question, and maybe you guys can report to me what the response is. If you've had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something, but then ignoring it and feeling sorry afterwards, just raise your hand. So strong gut feeling, ignoring it, regretting ignoring it, raise your hand. Tell me what you're seeing out there.
Well, can we show the audience? I mean,
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well,
basically raising their hands. I mean,
yeah, I mean, as I say, it's a pre-Thanksgiving crowd, so losing a lot of our class here. But the ones who came, they're here.
Again, are their hands up or not?
Yeah.
Well, did we show? Yeah.
But
their hands up.
Yeah. Okay. Now, here's what you just told me. You just told me the story of your childhood, because you never met a one-day-old infant who is not in touch with their gut feelings. That's all they got. So somewhere you learn to ignore your gut feelings. Why would you learn that? It goes back to what Bob said earlier. It's an adaptation. At some point, you learned that if you're authentically in touch with your emotions and you act on it, you threaten the attachments. Your parents won't like it. Like a 2-year-old might get angry, which, by the way, is very common, natural, and even healthy. But if the parents give the message that if you're angry, for example, if the parents follow the advice of another Canadian, Jordan Peterson, who says that an angry child should be made to sit by themselves till they come back to normal. That's what he says in his best-selling 12 Rules for Life. If the parents give you the message that if you're angry, you can't be with us, then the child faces a dilemma. I can have attachment or I can have authenticity, but I can't have both. Which one will I choose? And if the child chronically gets the message that if you show up as yourself, you're not acceptable to us as the nurturing caregivers, the child has to give up either the attachment, and no 2-year-old is going to walk out of the house with a bag on their back saying, okay, goodbye, I'd rather be myself, and give up the attachment, or they have to surrender the authenticity. But these patterns are not conscious. It's not a conscious decision that childs make. It's conditioned. It's unconscious. So once we give up our authenticity, we keep acting out our inauthenticity all our life. And we're afraid to be ourselves, to express our point of view, to know what we feel, to express what we feel. One of the needs of the child, one of the essential developmental needs of the child is the freedom to express all their emotions: grief, hatred, rage, sadness, joy, curiosity, playfulness, love, all of them, and have them validated, understood, and held by the adults. If as adults, for example, as me as a parent, as I was as a parent, because of my own trauma and stresses and workaholism and other issues, we weren't able to be there for my kids, to really see them, hear them, validate them, the child will shut down their true selves in order to be acceptable to the parent. So we sacrifice authenticity for attachment, and then we get to midlife or at some point and start asking ourselves, whose life is this anyway? And why am I so afraid to be myself? And that this culture feeds on people's fear of being authentic. And it caters to it. So it becomes all about face and image and surface rather than depth of authenticity as a human being.
And when you say, oh, sorry,
and that's okay. I further make the argument, as I've made in previous books, but more succinctly probably in this one, that that loss of authenticity then becomes a source of pathology of mind and body. That at the heart or at the root of autoimmune disease, malignancy. I know this sounds like a mouthful, and I may not have the time and space here to articulate the reasons, but I'm telling you, there's all kinds of scientific reasons why that pushing down of the authentic self actually damages our immune system, our physiology, let alone our psychic life.
And when you say that I think you said it rewards that inauthenticity, or it fosters it, and when I think that, like, when I think of it rewarding it, it's how, for example, like, people in mainstream media rise to the top not by exposing the lies of the government. For example, like Cy Hirsch, his story on the Nord Stream pipeline was pretty much unanimously ignored by mainstream media, even though he's more journalistically accomplished maybe than any other journalist alive today. And you have people that, like on Fox News and MSNBC and CNN, for example, that are running interference right now for the Israeli government committing a genocide against the Palestinians. And it's like, part of me, when I think of these people, I judge them, I think, and I sometimes have contempt for them. But it's more important, I think, right, to look at the structures that you're talking about that set up people to basically believe that they're alone if they are authentic, and can only get that attachment when they maybe lie to themselves as well as other people, right?
Well, look, so Cy Hirsch is not the only example. You got Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is the Pulitzer Prize winning former New York Times bureau chief for the Middle East. And he quit the paper because they wouldn't print his reportage on Gaza. This is years and years ago. This is very common. In those cases, the threat is very clear. You tell the truth, you're fired. But it's more subtle than that. Even if your job is not threatened, it's so frightening to go against the mainstream narrative, because it isolates you from your friends, perhaps from your family. Um, it it really risks isolation. So it's very difficult for people to question the narrative, not just about Israel, Palestine, but about anything, including the nature of this culture, including the nature of what it means to be a human being. I mean, again, if was there in the audience, I would ask them, how many of your experiences where on any issue, it doesn't matter, whether political or otherwise, you had something to say, but you suppressed yourself for fear of rejection? How free are you to be yourself in your relationship with your friends and your partner or spouse or lover? Can you say no when there's a no that you want to say? A lot of people will have a great difficulty with that. Not for fearing losing a job, but because they learned very early that I'm authentic, I won't be loved, I won't be liked. So it's a huge issue for a lot of people. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm mostly going to ask you to speak more to the insidious character of the thing of what you're describing. And one of the things that's so remarkable about capitalism today is how it has recuperated the idea of authenticity. You know, there's a cult of creativity. We're working with journalists and students who are going to go into, the film industry or into other kinds of media work. And you've seen this in Silicon Valley, like there's this really deliberate effort to build industry around getting people to be themselves or imagine they're being themselves just to that point where the hierarchy can be preserved, and so it's actually quite complicated at the level of language. So I understand why you're using the word authenticity, but I wonder how, did you wrestle with using that language? How do you, are there other words you use to designate that thing?
Well, the fact is that capitalism is absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's beyond brilliant in co-opting language, precisely because people don't feel authentic and they suffer from it. It'll make it into a commodity, which is the very opposite of authenticity, of course. But it's brilliant at co-opting language and people's anguish. You know what? I don't worry about using the language. I just ask people, where the truth of it is? It's in your body. Never mind the concept of authenticity. What does it feel like inside your body when you realize you're saying something that's not true for you? Or when you're not saying what is true for you? What does it feel like in your body when you suppress an emotion for the sake of preserving an attachment? What does that feel like for you? So intellectually, Silicon Valley can use the word authenticity and I can use it. It's the same word. But I'm suggesting we put it to a test. What does it feel like in here?
So let me take it a step further to where we're trying to end with this class, because we're basically examining a conceit that America has been this great experiment in democracy and freedom. And we have a constitution that enshrines the notion of independence of thought, and particularly its amendments, but the basic structure of the Constitution, a suspicion of power, a separation of power, and so forth. And we know that the founders themselves, of course, were given to a certain narrative that could not be questioned about wealth, about race, and so forth. But nonetheless, it persists. It persists. and nowhere more so than at schools of communication and journalism and so forth. After all, we are the media, we are the press, and yet in teaching this class and classes like it for the last 30 years, 25, 30 years here at Annenberg, I have relied on a small, painfully small collection of abnormal people called whistleblowers. Yeah. So in this class, we had John Kiriakou, the only person punished for being connected with the torture program. The only one. He went to jail, prison for 2 years. All the other people were applauded. One of them, General Petraeus, was an honored professor here, and even though he gave away, we had Daniel Ellsberg, who died recently, the one person who clearly told us what the Vietnam War was about. So I would like, I know you're going to run out of time here, but I would like to focus on that how is it that our society, which was designed or claimed to be designed that every individual would be a whistleblower. That was the conceit of the American experiment. Not that you would all stand loyally at a football game and pledge allegiance or something, or salute the flag, or get all excited about the national anthem. No, that you would be object to certainly genocide or any other assault on the gut feeling of humanity. So I would like to examine that, because basically what you're suggesting, and unfortunately what this experience of our Communications Association indicates, we are training the monsters of the future rather than the liberated souls of the future. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. Look, use the word conceit, which is an interesting word, because America is very conceited, actually. And I found that out when I first came to Canada. Let me tell you a story. I was 13 years old when the Hungarian Revolution broke out against communist rule in Hungary. And it was put on with brutal force by the Soviet army. So we became amongst 100,000 or 200,000 Hungarian refugees that left Hungary in 56, arrived in Canada in 57. And for me, America became the shining city on the hill. I grew up under the communist system. I believed in it. And all of a sudden, I got disillusioned overnight. Now, but my parents, who knew the nature of the system, would never dare to speak to me about it, because if I repeated what they said at home, they could be jailed. So I grew up believing in the system. I got disillusioned overnight in the space of a few days. We came to North America. I now looked to America as the source of freedom and light and the possibility in the world. In 1957, I went to, in the fall, I went to school, and in the woodwork shop, they played the World Series of baseball on the radio as we were doing our work. And this is a small point, but it's interesting, perhaps. In Hungary in 1950s, our football team, our soccer team, I should say, in North America, they call it soccer, was the best team in the world. We didn't lose a game for years. And we were the best in the world. In the world. Then I come to North America, and I'm listening to the World Series of baseball. And I'm thinking, what kind of World Series is this? There's only one country. United States. These are both American teams. How can they call it the World Series? And I thought to myself, only the Americans are arrogant enough to call it the World Series, and only the Canadians are stupid enough to believe them. That was my first exposure to American conceit. You think you guys are the world. And then later on, of course, the Vietnam War disillusioned me again. And disillusionment, losing your illusions. People say, I was disillusioned. I say, good. Would you rather be illusioned, as I say in the last chapter of this book, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Now, James Baldwin said, and I'm quoting again from the last chapter, The Myth and Normal. James Baldwin once said that words in this country are used to cover the speaker rather than to wake him up. And much of the job of the media is to cover the sleeper rather than to wake them up. And what does it say about our society that if you get two guys discussing the latest NBA game or the latest affair of the latest Hollywood celebrity with another Hollywood celebrity, it gets many more views than the mass killing that's going on in the Middle East right now? It means that this society is asleep to reality. Now, the word genocide, I don't use it. I quoted these Israeli scholars. I don't go so far as to use that word because to me, I reserve that for the horror that befell the Jews of Eastern Europe and similar situations in history. I'm content enough to call it mass killing or war crimes. But what does it say about us as a culture that a football game that has no consequence to anybody's life garners far more attention, excites far more agitation, invites far more analysis on an ongoing basis than the realities that beset our world internationally? That if you organized events around sports or entertainment, a lot more people will show up than would show up if you're going to talk about climate change. But what does that say? It means that this society is really good at putting its members to sleep. Why? Because if they were awake, this couldn't go on. And as far as communication is concerned, communication, being together and sharing information, that's the essence of communication. But what we should pay attention to and what we should communicate about and how we should communicate and what's the intention of communication, those are the questions we need to be asking.
Wow. Do we have a few minutes for questions from the class? Yeah. Okay.
I'd be delighted. Yeah.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm sorry for the technical problem here. Can we have the two mics?
There's a mic for you. Does anybody have a question?
Is this significant in any way? Does it matter?
The way when there are no questions, there's only two possibilities, three actually. One is what I've said was so pristine, clear, and crystal translucent that there could be no possibility of questions. That's a possibility. The other is what I'm talking about is so obscure and obfuscated, you don't know what to ask. The third is that you're afraid of looking bad. so
Well,
which is it?
I'm being saved by one of our stellar students. Yes.
Oh, great.
Can you see each other? No?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm curious, in your mind, on issues of public health, which, given health can feel very isolating, these concerns can feel very individual. How do we begin to sort of reframe this rhetoric to understand these as more cultural, communal, social concerns rather than an individual ailment? Right.
So if I told you that Indigenous women in Canada have 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of anybody else, rheumatoid arthritis being an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the body, it's meant to defend. And if I then further told you that prior to colonization, there was no autoimmune disease in the native population. If I told you that an American Black woman, the more experience of racism she is subjected to, the greater her risk for asthma. If I told you that the more stressed parents are, the greater the risk the child has for asthma. If I told you that colored people in the United States have shorter chromosomal protection on their chromosomes compared to Caucasians of their age. If I told you that people of color in the United States are more likely to have autoimmune disease, if I told you that American Black people have higher risk of cancer, of dying of it, even if the economics are equal, then the question is, are we looking at individual pathology in separate organs in an isolated body? Or are we talking about a social malaise? And the fact is, there's an American physician, George Engel, who in 1977 said that the flaw of modern medicine is that we separate the mind from the body and the individual from the social environment. And he called for a biopsychosocial view of medicine, meaning that the biology of human beings is inseparable from their psychology, and their psychology is inseparable from their relationships with their society, families, and culture, which is the only scientific way, which has been proven and overproven and double proven in all kinds of studies, and which point of view is completely ignored in the medical schools. So we have to talk about the gap between the science on the one hand, the reality on the one hand, and medical education on the other. And of course, if you ask, well, what does that separation serve? It serves a profit-driven healthcare system. That's what it serves.
And when I tell my friends and people that I know that a lot of these like the fact that you said the Black people are more likely to have asthma, I think, than Caucasians, that it's not a result of genetics, and there's actually no evidence of there being some genetic difference that causes Black people or indigenous people to have these ailments that other races don't have. A lot of times they'll say, well, what do you mean there's no evidence? You just told me that they're more likely to have it, so of course it's genetic. So can you explain why that isn't evidence, and what is the evidence behind what you're saying?
Well, first of all, there's no evidence because there's no evidence. That's why there's no evidence. Nobody's ever presented the evidence. Number one. Number two, genes don't function on their own. They are turned on and off by the environment. That's called epigenetics. This is science. So two people with the same genes will not have the same biology. Genes don't.
You just got cut off.
Okay, there are some genetic diseases. One of them runs in my family. If you have the gene, you'll have the disease. Muscular dystrophy. My mother died with it. My aunt died with it. I don't have the gene, but if I did, I'd have the disease. Those diseases are like 1 in 10,000, very rare. There are some diseases where there is some genetic predisposition. Breast cancer is one of them. But so that if you have the breast cancer gene, your risk of having the disease is much higher. But out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 have the gene. And there's no mental health condition that has been determined. Here's the gene, here's the disease. So that's just the reality. And so the confusion, Bob, is people think that if it's biological, it's genetic. It's not. Biology, human biology, is biopsychosocial. Our social environment, our relational environment, and our emotions actually affect our biology. And that's the human brain itself. There's another scientist at UCLA who wrote a book called The Social Brain. The brain itself is a social product. How the brain develops depends on the interaction of genes and the environment. So yes, there's biology, but that biology is not gene dependent.
Thank you. Yeah. So
Well, I just want to, you've gone. Could you just come back for a minute?
Gabor, I'm gonna admit Tarek Lubani to the call, and we'll massage a transition here.
Okay, why don't we do that? And, but I want to ask you to I want to go back to our student here who hasn't graduated
Hi,
yet.
Tarek.
And you've raised this question of the utility of knowing an inconvenient truth. And you've said, I'm basically creating a situation of frustration. And I mean, I wouldn't put it quite that way, but you wonder, what is why don't you put it in your own words? The trap that you have said students are in. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you've persistently raised a question about what is the value of this kind of education and what are we here to do? So put it in your own terms.
I think that's sort of a lot to put in my own terms. I'm struggling to sort of.
Well, just talk about what you've expressed at times about the inadequacies or the contradictions of our education.
Sure. I would argue that we can benefit most from sort of two distinct types of learning, right? One would be sort of a very liberal arts, open-minded, experience the world, get as much new knowledge in as you can, to sort of form a more informed perspective. And then the other, and that would be more theory-based, more, application applying thinkers and being a thinker yourself. And then the other side would be a very professional, sort of more almost like a more STEM degree, if you will, right? Learning skills that will be directly applicable to what you're going to be doing professionally. And I think a lot of times curriculums will not provide enough of either of those things. It will, try and focus too much on one or the other without being one or the other. And so certain courses and, certain education systems become inadequate in that way. We're not learning enough to either have a diverse worldview or to be prepared to enter the work environment. And it calls into question, why do we still need this education and need to, go into such tremendous debt for it, given that it really is both a precursor and also not entirely helpful in preparing us.
Did you hear the?
Yeah, I heard it. I'm just pondering the question. Well, to look at my own education, I was first an art student, then I went to medical school. I'm grateful for both streams. To me, the purpose of liberal arts education is not to teach you a bunch of facts, although, it's also not to teach you a bunch of facts, but much more important is to prepare a mind that's willing to quest and to question. And a lot of what passes for liberal arts education in the United States teaches people to quest and to question, which is within a very narrow range of intellectual parameters. They don't learn to question the fundamental assumptions of the system. They don't even realize that they're in a system that has fundamental assumptions. So essentially, even liberal arts education, for the most part, functions to have people not be aware that they're part of a system in an ideological bubble.
Yeah, it occurs to me that we are.
Sorry. But even that is being threatened, isn't it? The liberal arts education is under severe attack in the States right now. And the ideology, let's teach them skills. Skills to do what? Skills to serve a system whose functions we're not supposed to question. That it does an inadequate job of both is maybe the fact, but I'm telling you, it works. Because the end result is people who, for the most part, are unable and don't have the internal strength to question things, and who are materially driven to fit in, otherwise they don't make a living. So again, if I ask, is the system working? Yes, it is.